This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we talk about trees. They're on the decline statewide for a number of reasons, but there are efforts to expand the tree canopy in places like Hartford. We learn about the benefits of urban trees. That's coming up. First, there are 24 charter schools statewide that must follow state laws to operate. Connecticut Public's investigative unit, the Accountability Project, looked into a New London charter school that has been on probation by the state. And now the school's accrediting agency is also investigating the Interdistrict School for Arts and Communication. You can join our conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Joining us now with more on Zoom is Walter Smith Randolph, investigative editor and lead reporter for the Accountability Project at Connecticut Public. Walter, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Lucy. Good morning.
So can you give us a bit of background on this school? Again, it's the Interdistrict School for Arts and Communication in New London. I understand it's also known as Isaac?
Yeah, locally in New London, it's known as Isaac. It is a middle school serving grades 6 through 8, and it has about 270 students. There's a lottery that you have to be a part of and basically win a seat to get into the school.
And I mentioned that the school's on probation, and your story is that the probation has been extended. And so what happened?
Yeah, so last year, the state put the school on probation for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that the school doubled the rate that for special education students. So sending school districts, the school, Isaac, charges the sending school districts where the students are from to, educate them. So they doubled the rate, and the state basically said, you need to tell us how you came up with this method. And they were unable to prove how they came up with the method. So that was one reason. Another reason was computer disposals. The school sold some computers, and the state said that they didn't dispose of them properly, that they didn't wipe the information from them properly either. So those are just two of the reasons why the school was put on probation. It was supposed to end this month, and then the state visited the school on May 18th and said that they were very receptive to the visit and to coming up, and they came up with a corrective action plan. That's what happens when you put on probation. But they said, hey, what happened was so egregious that we need to continue watching you for another 6 months. And so you need to come up with the method of how you're hiking the special education rate. So we're going to keep you on probation and revisit this again in December or January.
I mentioned there are about 24 charter schools in Connecticut. And so what you just outlined, is that unusual for a charter school to be put on probation in our state, Walter?
Yeah, it is unusual. It's not something that happens very often, but if there's a problem that needs to happen, they will put the school on probation. I should also mention that they were also put on probation because they lack proper governing board oversight of school finances. So basically, the school has a board of trustees, and the state found that the board of trustees wasn't really operating efficiently or giving enough guidance to the school.
That's problematic when you think about overcharging school districts, thinking about how they're operating. But the accrediting body is also looking into the school. Why is that?
Yeah, so that's a different investigation. So a lot of what happened is because former teachers and some who were current teachers as well emailed the state saying, you need to take a look at these things are happening with the special ed, with the computers, with the governing board. But there are also complaints of a toxic work environment fostered by the executive director, Dr. Nicholas Spera. And so the accrediting agency, known as NIAS, they said that they have become aware of the complaints and that they have launched their own investigation to look into the climate and the culture of the school to see what's been going on. Dr. Nick Spera has been at the helm of the school for about 2 years. He came from the Marine Science Magnet High School in Groton, and he was there for about 8 years, but he left while under investigation. And through some of our investigative reporting, we found in his personnel file that he had been accused of fostering a toxic work environment before, that he had received a disciplinary letter saying that he actually discriminated against someone who was pregnant, and that could open up the school to different lawsuits. And he also did a survey in 2013 of marine science, and they found that the faculty experienced a culture and climate characterized as, quote, emotionally abusive, manipulative, and frightening. And so in our story, the three the two teachers and one former board director who work at Isaac said that basically carried over from marine science to Isaac, and that they had to work in a toxic work environment. So that's why NIAS is investigating.
You're hearing Walter Smith Randolph here on Where We Live. He's Connecticut Public's investigative editor and lead reporter for the Accountability Project as we learn about this New London charter school that's on probation by the state, and the school's accrediting agency is also investigating the Interdistrict School for Arts and Communication, also known as Isaac, in New London. You mentioned Dr. Spera. You mentioned he's executive director. So describe what that role is when we think about this charter school, Walter.
So there is a principal, and so the principal reports to the executive director. You can think of the executive director as maybe like the president of the school. So the executive director really sets the policies and procedures, works with the board, works on, fundraising and making sure the grants are in order. It doesn't necessarily deal with the daily operations or the students directly academically, but bigger picture. If it was a private school, it would be, he'd be the president.
And what has Dr. Spera told Connecticut Public about these allegations?
So we asked for interviews, and those interviews were denied by the chairman of the board, Richard Muckle. They actually said that they were, the board was, quote, wholly and fully satisfied with Dr. Spera's performance. And then we also received a letter from the lawyer saying that they thought that there should not be a recorded interview, that we should wait to publish our story until the end of the school year so we can see the reports, and then also that that they couldn't discuss some personnel issues, and that some people were probably talking to us because we were granting them anonymity, which we actually did not. Everyone we talked to that we quoted at least went on record, but we did talk to quite a number of people. We didn't quote them, but we talked to them on background, and they refused to go on record because they said that there's a fear of retaliation.
You mentioned the board. One of the people you spoke with was the former board director, Ms. Melendez. What was her experience? And I understand she told you it also impacted her son.
Yeah, so she said she was elected as vice chair of governance on the board. And she said as soon as she was in that position, she just noticed that things weren't going the way they're supposed to, that the executive director had a lot of involvement with the board of trustees. And, from her understanding, he was supposed to be ex officio, and that the board was supposed to come to a quorum and they were supposed to vote. But it seemed really like the executive director was pulling the strings of the board. And when she started asking questions, she said that's when her son, who was a student at the school, started having trouble. She said that he was locked out of his different assignments at the school. This was all happening during coronavirus, when students were at home. And so he couldn't get into some of his larger points assignments, which really affected his grades. So she pulled him out of the school, and she also resigned from her position. And she has filed a complaint with the State Commission on Human Rights.
Mm-hmm. You outlined these allegations of a toxic work environment, speaking to staff and former teachers. But I'm wondering, when we think about a school community, how have parents and even students, how are they responding, to these issues with Isaac?
So again, these are middle school students, so I haven't really heard from them. But I will say students at marine science have really come out of the woodwork to say, we're not surprised by this. This is what's happening in marine science. We can't even believe that, Isaac hired the executive director. Why is the state not doing anything? There's a lot of chatter on social media. Parents, it's a mixed bag. Some parents are just, shocked. But there are other comments from parents who are saying, hey, look, we don't have many better options. Where do you want us to send our kids? They're saying, I'm seeing some comments online that are saying, well, he's not dealing directly with the students. Maybe this is just a staff issue, a faculty issue. The school, we like the school, and we don't have any other options. So it is what it is. Mm.
When we think about the state's role, again, this is a charter school. And so can you walk us through, as the state has put the school on probation, what are some potential outcomes here?
So really the ideal outcome for the state and for the school is that the school comes up with a methodology for hiking rates. And the state says, okay, this makes a lot of sense. You've provided evidence. We're going to release you from probation and all is well. So that's, from a state perspective, what the ideal outcome is. As far as investigating the toxic work environment, alleged toxic work environment with Dr. Spera, the state says, hey, look, we have investigated. We are aware of the complaints. We've looked at it, but really there's not much we can do because he reports to the local board. The local board, it's really up to the local board to decide what to do. The local board is aware of what's happening because, again, the charter school has a board of trustees.
Mm-hmm. And the charter is granted and renewed by the state. But when our listeners are hearing about this, Walter, I mean, this is something that should be on everyone's radar. This is a school that also receives about, $3 million in state funding?
Yeah, in 2020, they received $3 million in federal and state funding that they received. And yes, the state does grant their charter. And so their charter is up for renewal next year. And so is their accreditation with the accrediting agency. So I would not be surprised if these become issues or topics that they talk about.
And Walter, what's been the response from the community after the reporting of this story?
It's a small community out of New London, and some folks are familiar with marine science, and so I've been seeing lots of not again, like how is this continuing? When is this going to stop? So that's been a lot of the reaction that I'm seeing as far as online chatter.
And so meanwhile, the state and accrediting agency are investigating, and when are they expected to report back?
So the state is going to revisit probation in December and January or January and take a look at that again. And the accrediting agency says that their investigation will come to an end in July, and then it'll become a matter of public record. So we'll be following up on that.
That's Walter Smith Randolph, investigative editor and lead reporter for the Accountability Project at Connecticut Public. Walter, do you want to remind our listeners if they have some tips they want to send your team, how to do so?
Yes, please reach out to us and email us at tips@ctpublic.org. That's TIPS@ctpublic.org. You can also follow us on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Walter Reports.
Thank you, Walter, for your time today.
Thank you.
You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. Coming up after the break, we're going to explore urban trees. Have you thought about how much a tree is worth? More after the break. You can join us too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Trees are vital in so many ways. They provide oxygen and shelter us from the sun. They're home to wildlife. Trees also play an important part in the fight against climate change by storing carbon and reducing emissions. Scientists tracking trees in our state note their declining numbers. In Hartford, increasing the tree canopy is one of the goals of a climate action plan developed by the Hartford Climate Stewardship Initiative. Efforts are ongoing to boost the city's urban forest, which has declined, like many cities, due to disease, bug infestations, strong storms, and natural aging. To learn more, joining us now on Zoom is Heather Dionne, who's the Hartford City Forester. Heather, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I mentioned you're the city forester, so can you explain your role to our listeners?
Well, essentially, I take care and manage 560,000 trees, and they're not all within city limits of Hartford. You know, we have parks that expand beyond in West Hartford and New Britain and Wethersfield and Windsor. So just making sure that the trees are safe and making sure that the residents are safe as well. So it's a two-part approach, I guess, to the job. I'm also on call basically 365 days a year, 24/7, because if there's any issues with a tree going down, or we have an impending storm, or we just need to respond to strange emergencies like trees on fire or cars hitting trees, then I'm there.
Did you say 560,000 trees? That's a lot of trees, Heather.
It's a lot of trees, yes.
So, do you have a robust staff? I mean, how are you able to maintain, all of that, those trees?
Well, we don't have a super robust staff as of yet, but we're in the process. Right now I have 3 tree trimmers, and then we also have a couple contractors that we work with. So essentially, any tree that is maintained in terms of pruning or that needs to be removed is vetted through me. And the same basically goes for planting throughout the city. So
I'm curious, when I said that you were the Hartford City Forester, I understand you're the first woman to hold this position. What attracted you to the work?
I had a really passionate high school teacher who's now a professor at UConn, Dr. Tom Abbott, who really inspired me and made a couple connections. I had a boss who is no longer with us, Chuck Conklin from the town of Coventry, who was the tree warden. And Tom Abbott kind of introduced me to him. I was doing a lot of field work for my studies, and the rest is history. I basically declared that when I got older, I wanted a job like Chuck's, but in a larger scale.
And so, how long have you been the city forester, Heather?
10 years now.
Wow. When we think about earlier, when you were mentioning all the times that you and your team will respond when there's issue with a tree, what has it looked like for you the last few years? When we think about there was the drought a few summers ago, then we've got a lot of severe storms, and when we think about Hartford and just the age of the trees, how many trees would you say have been lost recently, and why it's so important to boost the tree canopy again?
Oh gosh. So, I mean, we've obviously dealt with a few seasons of drought. 2016 to 2018 was pretty trying because I could definitely see rapid decline of the trees. There was a response to drought, like sudden limb drop, trees that were just kind of blowing over with that you wouldn't think were having any issues, but there was hardly any root system left because it had essentially dried up. And just so responding to that made it quite difficult. And then of course dealing with invasive insects like emerald ash borer. And then shortly after that drought season, we had an infestation of two-line chestnut borer. So we've been very, very busy. I had more money in the budget last year than what I had in the past. So I really hit some of our trouble spots where I constantly get calls where we have large trees, did thorough assessments on those, and, made the determination whether or not they're going to stay. And if they're staying, we're pruning, we're doing a lot of crown reductions, crown cleaning, and just trying to keep them standing as long as possible.
At the top, I had mentioned all the benefits that trees provide, but when we think about urban trees and some of the challenges with the canopy, but also why they're so important, Heather, can you walk us through that?
Well, the city gets hot. I mean, if you drive, 30 minutes out of the city to the suburbs or whatever, there's more tree cover. The temperature is drastically less, and it's just more comfortable. So dealing with really hot temperatures, we have a lot of impervious surface, a lot of concrete and asphalt, and that attributes to, tempers and mental health issues. You get higher asthma rates, which is pretty scary. And then just stormwater issues. Obviously, our storms have been more sudden, more intense. So the trees that we have in the city that are standing are incredibly valuable. Every little tree is incredibly valuable, and just trying to maintain that and keep the public safe, and then planting more. It's a whole process.
And we think about the trees that are in Hartford. I mean, what are the more common ones? And when we think about efforts to be aggressive with tree planting, what does that mean in terms of the types of trees that you want to be planting in the city?
So, I mean, we have a lot of oaks. And then we have, a tremendous amount of like Norway maples, red maples, some sugar maples, London plane. London plane does wonderful in the city, honey locust. And so when we're planting, I mean, there's a couple native species that we find just cannot tolerate the heat and salt. So we don't really plant any more sugar maples unless they're in a park. And even still, you're kind of taking a gamble with that. Our native flowering dogwood is another tree that, doesn't like hot temperatures and such. So we mix it up. I mean, Japanese pagoda tree is a insanely strong tree. The honey locust is incredible, diversity wise. And so another thing that I have to take into account is if Hartford was to be hit with Asian longhorn beetle. So I try to diversify as much as possible. The top tree of choice for that insect is the maple, or maple species. So just trying to diversify. They don't like oaks, they don't like hickory, and they don't touch conifers. So blending those trees in more is a focus as well. And, and of course, I know a lot of people love natives and they're like, they wanted to see all natives and such, but it's a totally different climate in the city. And we have to diversify. So.
You're hearing Heather Dionne here on Where We Live. She's Hartford City Forester as we talk about the urban tree canopy. One of the goals is to boost the number of trees in Hartford, part of the climate action plan developed by the Hartford Climate Stewardship Initiative. We're going to be hearing about that, more about that coming up. Again, you can join us if you are planting trees in your neighborhoods, or if you're thinking about the role of urban trees. Our number 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I mentioned that Heather is a Hartford City Forester. Another City Forester arborist joining us now on Zoom is William Bryant Logan. He's also a teacher, author of several books, including Sproutlands, Tending the Endless Gift of Trees. Bill, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me. This has been great so far. I've enjoyed listening to Heather.
Wonderful. And we were just talking about the importance of diversity when boosting the number of urban trees, all of the factors working against trees, including invasive insects. And so you do a lot of work in New York City. So tell us about your work and how you would respond to the importance of urban trees, Bill.
Well, I mean, I've taken care of trees in New York City for more than 30 years now, which makes me pretty old. But I always remember one of the first times we were ever up in trees in the back behind an apartment building somewhere in Manhattan. Somebody leaned out the window while we got up in the tree. We were there to prune them, and yelled, "If you hurt our trees, we'll call the police." There's a lot of affection and really more than affection, almost attachment to trees in New York City. And I think it's partly because trees give people a connection to a world that we didn't make and a world that we don't really own, that goes on by itself. And so people's connection to trees in the cities, I think, is important for all of the reasons that are now documented, for what they do with pollution, for what they do with getting particulate matter out, for reducing temperatures, as Heather said, for all of those things, but also just for this kind of intangible benefit they give us when we're near them.
So there's an intangible benefit. There are the health benefits, but also the mental health benefits, especially when we think about cities where there may not be a lot of green space, where they're dealing with a lot of hot temperatures in the summertime, and people want a place for shelter. Bill, talk us through those.
Yeah, well, I think in part, certainly you experience it. They've done these, we've been part of urban heat island effect studies in New York. And it's interesting that when we've planted large numbers of trees in the Bronx and also in lower Manhattan, and they haven't reported great declines in temperature there because they're kind of going by airplane and looking at everything overall. But everybody who lives in those neighborhoods notices it immediately in the summer when they have a canopy over their heads. You walk from out of the trees to under the trees and you go, oh, thank goodness. So I think that you can feel I often feel a visceral relaxation that occurs when I'm suddenly under the shade of a tree. And so I think that it's extremely important for people in cities, again, because as Heather said, there's so much impervious surface that is often very reflective and very hot, to have this refuge that's right there beside us, right on the streets often.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you go about increasing tree coverage, especially in a place like New York City, and maybe some lessons as we think about how communities in our state, Bill, are also working towards this goal?
Well, New York City did, under Mayor Bloomberg, did the Million Trees Project, which was an effort to plant a huge number of trees. And in some respects, it certainly succeeded in doing that. So that was very successful in that measure. What was not so clear was how they would take care of them. And that's the continual challenge that we face, is to have enough resources to take care of the trees we have in the ground so that they can mature to be beautiful trees that will last a long time and give all the benefits that we want them to give. So that's kind of the challenge in New York City. We're planting a lot of trees now. We also have to take care of them. We've also planted numbers of trees for this urban heat island effect study that was done by New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So there's large scale entities who are doing planting. And also, as I said, people are, at least in our experience in our company, are just nuts about trees. And we have one client who is continually looking for someplace she can put another tree. And we're going, Diana, you don't have any room. You can't put another. She says, well, what about over here? So we also meet people who don't want to get rid of trees in New York. So it's not uniformly that way, but there's pretty good effort now to get trees in the ground. The main challenge is how to take care of them.
You can join our conversation as we focus on urban trees. Our number 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Heather, I've mentioned a couple times now this plan in Hartford to increase the tree canopy. Tell us about the plan, and what are some of the barriers right now?
Well, the plan is to plant 3,000 trees a year for the next 50 years, and to increase our canopy coverage from 25% to 35%. And essentially the challenge is funding, because obviously these trees cost money to purchase, to plant, and then to maintain. And just oversight. I handle all the trees, mature and new. So bandwidth for that is also a challenge.
And so as part of this plan, it's a public-private partnership in a way where, the city is maybe fundraising and able, or maybe allocating more money from the budget to plant these trees in neighborhoods, especially those that don't have a lot of trees, but also, leaning on residents to take it upon themselves to help. I wonder if you can talk about that.
Sure. So 50% of our canopy is located on private property. So if anyone is ever wondering how they can help, my first suggestion is, do a little research or contact me or the Connecticut Urban Forest Council or your local tree warden and talk about tree species and start planting on your own property, because that's pretty significant. better yet, if you can involve children or grandchildren or, the neighborhood, because obviously trees are kind of communal and bring everybody together. What was can you repeat the question?
I was just wondering more that residents can do, and we think about areas of the city that don't have a lot of trees. So if you prioritize where the tree planting needs to happen first, what neighborhoods are we talking about?
Clay Arsenal is a prime example of an area where there's very little tree canopy and very little opportunity to plant. It's an older neighborhood. The structures are crammed in there, so there's very little. There's really no right of way along the street to plant trees. There's hardly any front yards, and then you're looking to the backyard. So there's a lot of outreach that's required there. Fortunately, a lot of our NRZ groups are getting involved. We have an incredible tree advisory commission that is great with advocacy. We have a Facebook page called Capitol Forest. So just getting the word out on how important trees are is the number one thing. We've been planting a lot in schoolyards. One thing I noticed when I started in Hartford was that there was no shade, no trees in the schools or on the property of the school. So we really focused on school plantings. We just did some planting last season to fill in some gaps in several areas and involve, the superintendent and really everybody. We did the same thing with our firehouses and got the fire department involved. So there's a lot of advocacy, there's a lot of education, and it's all about getting everybody involved.
Again, you can join us if you have a question about tree planting where you live. Today's focus on urban trees as we learn more about this plan to increase the tree canopy in the city of Hartford by 35% tree canopy in 50 years. How did you come up with that number, Heather?
Well, we ended up getting some grant funding to put together the Tree Canopy Action Plan, which was done in 2019. And our consultant did a ton of research and then used our GIS data, our census data, just numbers, and put together this incredible plan, prioritizing neighborhoods for planting, prioritizing parks for planting, recommendations for that key number, that 3,000 trees a year, and then also staffing and what our budget should be looking at, including marketing and more of that outreach and education. It's so comprehensive. I'll be honest, I've never seen such a good tree plan. And I'm super proud to have been a part of it and grateful for those that contributed.
Again, our number, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Paul's calling in. Paul, what's your comment or question? Oh, looks like Paul is not there, but I do have his comment in front of me. I wanted to read this to Bill, who was our other guest. Paul calling in from the Stonington area. He says, I've seen in the last 4 years, unbelievable bagworm eradicated thousands of trees. I see it in my gardens and my clients. I work from Boston and New York, never used to be here. And so he's talking again about some of these insects that are so detrimental to trees. So what can you tell us about that, Bill?
That's very interesting. I have not heard of, I've seen bagworm infestations in limited areas, but I would be very interested to hear where it's expanding. It's a very interesting creature. Well, it's called bagworm because it manages to build, using the foliage of the plant that it's attacking, a little nest out of that foliage. So sometimes you don't even notice them until you see this little teardrop shaped thing that isn't exactly, it has the foliage, but it's not the right shape. And then, you have bagworms. So it can be a serious issue. I'd be interested to hear more about that one because I haven't seen that as a broad issue as much, though maybe it's something on the approach. There are so many pests and diseases that are coming so quickly now. One example is beach leaf disease. A couple of years ago, they said, oh, this is a problem on American beaches, not on European ones, and it's limited to coastal areas. And then gradually it's more on more American beaches in more places, more quickly. Then it's on American and European beaches. And now it's possible that it's an extremely serious problem. And this is not the only one. We're seeing a lot of these happening now. So among the invasive problems that we're facing, some of the worst ones are pests and diseases.
Mary's calling in from Hartford. Mary, what did you want to share?
Hi, this is Mary Pelletier. Heather, who I know, I work along the North Branch of the Park River, and what we've found is that there's some considerable forests along the North Branches and the South Branch of the Park River. And this is true in many of our towns throughout Connecticut, that there's forests that are unprotected, and they're all along the rivers and the waterways. And we can protect these forests now and help mitigate urban heat island effects, and also improve just nature in our neighborhood, the amount of oxygen and air quality, because these waterways are largely overlooked. But there's another point I wanted to make, which is it is hard to establish trees that are brought in from faraway nurseries throughout the city, but we can stop mowing in select areas in city parks. And often, if we select those areas and we begin to train people who cultivate native species that emerge, these volunteer trees are proving, I've heard from other parts of the country, to be stronger trees, because many of these trees are part of the integral forests of those historic parks, which were established before these nurseries were created. It's a way for cities to save money and improve their tree canopies within the parks that are old parks that were really established before the practice of bringing nursery trees in and paying for them. And one other point about pests and bugs, and I'd like to just note that there's concerns that these issues of diseases are turning into ways to harvest trees or reasons to quote unquote manage forest. But, we have to remember, having just gone through the pandemic ourselves, that allowing our bodies, our forests, our organic systems to develop immune responses may be part of the work, along with management and care. So I think learning how we can cultivate life and nature is part of the work, not just tree removal, extraction and planting cultivars, which are often same seed stocks and not don't have the genetic variety.
Thank you, Mary, for your call. We're going to be running out of time shortly, but I wanted to thank you for calling in, making some very interesting points. I wanted to thank William Bryant Logan for joining us, again, an arborist, teacher, and author of Sproutlands, Tending the Endless Gift of Trees. Now, if you're interested in learning more about urban trees, and you can hear more from Bill, the Garden Club of Hartford is hosting an event June 15th, open to the public. More information at gchartford.org. We'll be sure to tweet out that link. Bill, thank you for your time today. It was really great to hear from you.
Great, thank you. I very much enjoyed it.
Now, Heather Dionne, the Hartford City Forester, will stay with us. After the break, we're going to talk more about diseases and insects impacting Connecticut trees. If you have a question, you can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The emerald ash borer, the spongy moth, just some of the invasive insects plaguing trees in our state. Add in previous droughts and powerful storms in recent years, and you begin to understand why many trees have died. Joining us now with more on Zoom, Andrea Urbano, Central District Service Forester at the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Andrea, welcome to our show. Andrea, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're live on the radio. Welcome to our show. Yeah. I had mentioned some of the invasive insects that are causing disease and problems with trees statewide. Tell us about them.
Certainly. Well, there are several invasive insects that are impacting Connecticut's forested landscape across the urban to rural gradient, some of which have been around for decades. Some are newer introduced species. Most are from Asia or Eurasia, the hemlock woolly adelgid, emerald ash borer, spongy moth, previously known as gypsy moth. And there are others that are at threat of introduction, like jumping worms. Bill mentioned earlier beech leaf disease and Asian longhorn beetle, which is not yet in Connecticut, but is in neighboring states.
We had a caller earlier who does a lot of work and I believe lives on the eastern side of the state, mentioning bagworm. And I'm wondering if you can talk more about that and also, you know, what we've seen on the eastern side of the state when it comes to tree decline.
Certainly. That was an interesting call, as I am not familiar either with bagworm being an issue plaguing Connecticut's forests at this time. It's certainly defoliant and affects tree health and forest function. But really the issue in the eastern part of Connecticut and the Northeast at large is spongy moth. The timing, as you mentioned earlier, Lucy, of spongy moth outbreaks with these recent years of pretty severe and extensive drought. There is a soil-borne fungus that's lethal to the spongy moth and keeps its population in check naturally, but without soil moisture and in periods of drought, that fungus is not able to live and thrive and function as a biological control effort. So as a result, by 2020, the Agricultural Experiment Station documented that spongy moth caterpillars defoliated about 156,000 acres, most of which are in eastern Connecticut. And in 2021, those acres are reported to be over 45,000, mostly now in Litchfield County in northwestern Connecticut. And that is related to a drought that region experienced in 2020.
That sounds like a lot of trees that we're talking about that have died. So what's the fix? So what can be done here?
So there is really no fix when you're thinking of at this spatial scale. Mm-hmm. The goal of foresters and hopefully of landowners is to foster a resilient forested landscape. And by that, I mean a forest that is able to respond to a disturbance like that of the spongy moth and drought by resisting damage or stress and recovering quickly. Invasive insects and plants alike compromise resilience, but with proper stewardship, informed, active, and passive forms of management, we can foster resilience and improve our forest's ability to recover. So the hope here is that this disturbance can help promote advanced regeneration of native trees, foster some diversity in our future forests, both structurally and in species composition. And I'll just mention quickly, Lucy, that this is not the first time Connecticut has endured spongy moth outbreaks. In 1981, it was recorded that 1.5 million acres were defoliated by the spongy moth. And here we are in 2022 with still mostly an oak hickory forest that is doing okay despite more recent outbreaks. So our forests are inherently resilient. they will recover, especially with the help of us trained professionals and the private landowners that are really responsible for most of Connecticut's forested landscape.
You mentioned the trees that we've lost on eastern Connecticut, and now mentioning also in the Litchfield area. Should people be planting more oaks? We've had Douglas Talmy on the show talking about the vital role that oaks play.
Yeah, oaks are integral to the health of Connecticut's forested landscape. White oak in particular is exceptionally valuable for wildlife, pollinators, and they're one of, if not the longest lived tree species in Connecticut. So they have great potential for carbon storage and climate mitigation benefits. So yes, oaks should not be avoided in our planting or management goal efforts. They require disturbance to regenerate naturally in the forested landscape. And that is precisely why Connecticut's current forested landscape is occupied by so much oak, because of our land use history, which is grounded in, clearing the landscape for agriculture and then again for charcoal production. So actually implementing informed and strategic active management in the rural forested landscape can really help promote oaks on the landscape. Planting them as well in the right place is appropriate. The key there is right tree, right place. Having species diversity within the Quercus or oak genus. And then, of course, not focusing exclusively on oak. As Heather mentioned, it's important to have species diversity, but also structural diversity. So different age classes, different size classes, different arrangements of these trees.
Heather Dionne is still with us, Hartford City Forester. We just have about a minute left, Heather. I just wanted to mention, the role that Knox plays in helping increase the urban tree canopy in Hartford. Can you tell us briefly?
This is a nonprofit in the city of Hartford who trains apprentices from the city to plant trees throughout, and it's been a great success. They're a wonderful partner, and honestly, if you're looking to contribute somehow in Hartford, I highly recommend making a donation to their organization.
Again, that's Heather Dionne, Hartford City Forester. Thank you for coming on the show to tell us about this tree plan, part of the Climate Action Plan here in the city of Hartford, and thank you for your time today on the show.
Thank you.
Also with us was Andrea Urbano, Central District Service Forester at the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Andrea, thanks you for the information that you shared with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being part of your morning.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical director is Kat Pastor. We'll be back tomorrow.